David and Louise Turpin were the picture of a loving religious couple. 13 children, matching family outfits, Disneyland smiles. But behind the walls of their suburban California home was a prison. Starved, shackled, silenced. For years, the Turpin children lived in fear, hidden in plain sight, until one daughter escaped and revealed a horror the world could hardly believe. It began in the dry, sun-split outskirts of Princeton, Texas, a place where dust clung to everything and time felt a few decades behind. The kind of town where silence was the natural state of things, where secrets settled like the dust, quietly, in the corners. David Allen Turpin was born in 1961 in West Virginia, raised in a deeply conservative working-class household where obedience was prized above expression. His father, a stern figure with a jaw like concrete and hands calloused from long hours at a Virginia paper mill, had little tolerance for deviation from order. David grew up solemn, inward, smart with numbers, and gifted in science, but socially odd. Always an outsider. He walked with hunched shoulders even as a teenager, his eyes often staring just past people, as though observing life through a pane of glass. He met Louise Anna Robinette in Princeton High School. She was a few years younger, brash and dramatic, always pulling at the seams of small-town life. Her family was even more devout than his, deeply rooted in the Church of Pentecostalism, where sin was around every corner and deliverance was a lifelong struggle. Louise's childhood had its own hauntings, rumors of manipulation, control, and inappropriate spiritual rituals done under the guise of cleansing. She had a complicated relationship with her mother, Phyllis, who believed she was a chosen vessel for God's message, and saw demons in music, fashion, and even education. When David and Louise began their relationship, it was as though two storms met. She was wild, needy, aching for escape. He was calculated, repressed, and quietly yearning for control. He was her exit ticket, and she was his willing subject. They married when she was just 16. Her parents signed the permission slip without protest. In fact, Phyllis believed it was a divine union, that David had been sent by God to take Louise away from worldly temptations. The newlyweds drove away in a second-hand maroon sedan with Texas plates and left behind the dusty lanes of Princeton for the promise of something greater. David's job at Lockheed Martin in Fort Worth and the rigid life of religious domesticity they would begin to build together. They settled in a modest neighborhood, a brick one-story near a row of failing cotton fields. To the outside world, they were quiet, if odd. Louise rarely spoke to neighbors, and when she did, it was in clipped, rehearsed sentences, as if she were constantly aware someone might be listening. David went to work in neatly pressed shirts, carrying a metal lunchbox, and never attended any company socials. At home, he began drawing up strange household rules in a spiral notebook. Meal times scheduled down to the minute, a log for phone calls, and a list of books they could or could not read, mostly biblical texts and esoteric fringe theology. It was around this time they became fascinated with a warped interpretation of Christian fundamentalism, not the kind practiced by mainstream Pentecostals, but a twisting hybrid of isolationist dogma, apocalyptic warnings, and cult-like submission. David, obsessed with numerology and prophecy, began reading literature that claimed God's chosen could live outside time, that they could be kept undefiled by separating from the world entirely. Louise clung to these beliefs as if they were scripture. Together they stopped attending church, claiming churches had become corrupted, and began holding their own services in their living room, with David preaching and Louise speaking. In tongues, their first child, Jennifer, was born in 1988. She was a quiet baby, slow to cry, with wide, searching eyes that took in everything. Louise immediately took to the idea that Jennifer was different, chosen, pure, and to be protected at all costs. but protection quickly bled into restriction. The baby was kept inside most days, windows covered with thick quilts, even in Texas heat. Louise said the sun carried Satan's vibrations. By the time their second and third children were born, David had moved the family into a more remote property on the edge of Rio Vista, a dusty blip of a town south of Fort Worth. The home was larger, more secluded, with a rusted gate and acres of dry brush behind it. No neighbors within earshot. This isolation was intentional. Inside, the house took on the feel of a slowly tightening box. Curtains were nailed shut. Locks appeared on more doors. Louise began homeschooling, if you could call it that. Daily readings from the Old Testament, long monologues about angels and demons, and vocabulary lists built from Bible concordances. David had started keeping journals, thousands of pages filled with schedules, thoughts about purity maintenance, dietary charts, and future family rules. His control deepened in slow increments, like cement hardening around them all. The children weren't allowed to speak without permission. They weren't allowed to laugh. If one disobeyed, they all went without food, often for days. Louise began calling this method discipline through unity. She claimed it was how God corrected the Israelites in the wilderness. At night, David would sit at the kitchen table beneath a single flickering bulb and rewrite the same sentence again and again in his journal. Obedience brings holiness. Disobedience brings disorder. Obedience brings holiness. By the late 1990s, there were 6 children, most pale, thin, and unnaturally quiet. None of them attended school. When a Jehovah's Witness came knocking one morning and noticed the children staring silently from the hallway, he later reported to a friend that something wasn't right. But nothing ever came of it. Meanwhile, David's career was still stable. He worked as an engineer and was well paid, but most of the money went into bizarre purchases, hundreds of dollars worth of children's clothes that were never worn, religious artifacts from obscure websites, and strange food hoards that were eventually discarded. There were no toys, no family photos, just stacks of Bibles, rotting furniture and locks, so many locks, not just on doors, but on cabinets, drawers, and refrigerators. Louise's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She began watching old family sitcoms obsessively, believing God was showing her how families should appear to the world. She once forced the children to reenact a scene from Full House, filming them with a second-hand camcorder. But afterward, she punished them for smiling too worldly on camera. By 2005, the family had 12 children. Each birth widened the cracks. They'd started sleeping in shifts, not for safety, but because the house was too chaotic to allow rest. The youngest was still crawling. The oldest were now teenagers, with hollow stares, their growth stunted by years of starvation and emotional neglect. One day, Louise's sister Elizabeth came to visit. They hadn't spoken in years, but Louise allowed her in, briefly. Elizabeth noticed the house reeked of urine. The children looked emaciated. None greeted her. When she tried to hug the youngest girl, Louise snapped, "Don't touch her unless she invites the Holy Spirit first." Elizabeth left in tears. She later tried to alert other family members, but was told not to interfere. David began planning a move to California. He claimed it was a calling, that the Lord had revealed a new beginning awaited them in the West. In truth, the isolation in Texas was no longer enough. He wanted a place where no one knew them, no relatives, no old neighbors, just him, Louise, and the divine order he believed he was destined to create. In the spring of 2010, they packed their entire life into a white van and left Texas behind. No forwarding address, no goodbyes, just a thick trail of silence and a house filled with broken furniture and matted carpets soaked in secrets. They were heading to Perris, California, a desert town that would soon become synonymous with horror. But, for now, They were just a large family in a big van, driving toward a future more terrifying than any of their neighbors in Texas could have imagined. Perris, California wasn't the kind of place people noticed. A sun-blasted town in Riverside County, flanked by dull hills and bordered by dust-choked roads, it lay dormant and overlooked, exactly the kind of place the Turpins wanted. There were houses here, yes, tidy rows of them, cheap enough to attract working-class families and far enough from Los Angeles to remain off-grid. That anonymity, that facelessness, was the appeal. The Turpins bought a beige stucco house on Muir Woods Road in 2014. From the outside, it looked like any other suburban home. 2 stories, a modest yard, a driveway that never saw use. The front blinds were always drawn. A van was parked out front, never moved, its tires slowly sagging into the curb. The mailbox collected dust. Neighbors barely remembered seeing anyone go in or out. Inside, the house was deathly quiet. The children, now numbering 13, were instructed never to make noise that could be heard through the walls. They moved like ghosts, barefoot, slow, obedient. David had crafted an environment where fear was a form of architecture. Each child was assigned a small mattress, most stained and bare, placed on floors in various corners of the house. Bedrooms weren't places of comfort. They were cells. The door handles were installed backward, so they locked from the outside. Food was scarce and became a form of psychological warfare. There were boxes of frozen food in the fridge, even roasts left to rot, but only David and Louise could eat them. The children were fed 1 meal a day, sometimes less, and even that had to be earned: a piece of bologna, a slice of bread, tap water from the bathroom sink, and still they prayed. Louise insisted that everything was part of God's discipline, that the children were unruly sinners being prepared for divine elevation. They were not to speak without permission. They were not to wash their bodies unless allowed. They could not brush their teeth, cut their hair, or read anything beyond the old, annotated Bible. Louise kept tucked in a drawer lined with nail clippings and family punishments written in red ink. Punishments grew more inventive. If a child was caught taking food, even a single grape, they were chained to a bed, first for hours, then for days, then weeks. Eventually, it became standard. Thick chains padlocked to the bed frame, with the child's limbs left raw and scabbed. Sometimes more than one child was shackled. Sometimes they were gagged. David, for all his silence, was no less complicit. He kept notes. He logged infractions. He calculated how long each child should be chained and whether a sin merited loss of food, silence for a day, or physical pain. Yet to the outside world, he was the same mild-mannered computer engineer. He continued working remotely, his LinkedIn profile listing him as employed by defense firms and tech companies. He even posted pictures of family outings, rare, staged. Events where the children looked gaunt, frozen, eerily smiling in identical clothing. Disneyland, Vegas. Matching shirts, rigid postures, forced grins. Louise would post the images on Facebook with captions like "family bonding time," followed by emojis and hearts. The comments always said the same thing: "Beautiful family, such great parents, you're blessed." No one knew what was happening behind those stucco walls. Neighbors, on the rare occasion they saw the family, were struck by the strange quietness of the children. One woman recalled watching a line of kids. Some looked well into their teens, but moved like toddlers, marching 2 by 2 into the house. They didn't talk. They didn't make eye contact. Some had strange haircuts, like they'd been hacked with kitchen scissors. Their skin looked grey, their arms too thin. The woman waved once. None of the children waved back. Inside the home, the children were living in cycles of torment and delusion. Jennifer, the eldest, had begun to write music in her mind. She'd never had an instrument, never had lessons, but she constructed melodies. To survive, Soundless songs she'd hum into her pillow, careful not to be heard. She believed God might hear them if no one else could. Jordan, the 13-year-old, was beginning to question. She read food labels in secret when Louise left wrappers on the floor. She watched her parents for signs of weakness. She imagined the outside world like a myth, the idea of real beds, clean water, friends, and began to believe they might exist. The seeds of escape had taken root. The younger ones, however, didn't know they were prisoners. They believed it was normal. This was life. The chains, the beatings, the rot, the prayers, the stench of their own filth. Normal. Louise had once told them that people on the outside would laugh at them, that no one would believe them, that social workers were demons sent to break families apart and take children to hell. She said if they ever tried to run, the dogs would get them, or the police would shoot them. Still, small rebellions started to flicker. One child tried to write a journal, secretly carved into the drywall beneath her mattress with the jagged edge of a broken spoon. Another stole a phone from Louise's drawer and tried to look up the word abuse. The screen time was limited, but the word stuck. On January 14, 2018, everything changed. Jordan, now 17 but weighing only 82 pounds, woke at 5 a.m. Her sister had just been caught stealing peanut butter and was now shackled again. The room stank of urine and rusted metal. She'd had the secret phone hidden in the mattress for 2 days. That morning, her hands trembling, she unlocked the window. The air was freezing. Her bare feet hit the concrete and went numb instantly. But she ran, out of the house, past the white van, across the street, down the sidewalk, into a neighborhood she had only seen through the slits of curtains. She ran until her lungs tore and her breath came in clouds. Then she stopped, crouched, behind a stop sign, and called 911. She had never spoken to a stranger before. Her voice cracked. She didn't know the word for medication. She didn't know her own address, but she said one thing with absolute clarity. "My parents are abusing us." The 911 dispatcher asked if anyone was in danger. Jordan paused, then said, "Yes, my sisters are chained up right now." The call came through to the Riverside County Sheriff's Department just after 5:45 a.m. on a chilly Sunday morning. The voice on the other end was shaky and odd, like someone who had learned English from books, but not people. The dispatcher marked the call as a welfare check, possible child endangerment, no urgency assigned. Deputy Anthony Collis was the first to respond. When he pulled up to the beige house on Muirwoods Road, he saw the teenage girl standing awkwardly on the sidewalk, clutching a battered cell phone, wearing soiled clothing that looked more like pajamas from another decade. Her skin was pale. Her limbs looked too thin for her body. She smiled nervously as he approached, though the smile never reached her eyes. Jordan spoke quickly, her words tumbling. "They're my parents. They hurt us, some of my siblings. They're chained. I think some of them might be dying." He tried to calm her, asked her to repeat herself. She did, slower this time, but no less strange. He asked her if she had ID. She didn't. She wasn't even sure what a school ID looked like. When he asked her age, she said 17, but her voice cracked, and she immediately followed with, "People always say I look younger." She explained she had never been to a doctor, never been to school, never had a friend. Deputy Collis radioed for backup and requested a supervisor on scene. Something was off, way off. This wasn't a prank. The girl wasn't acting. She was sincere, frightened, and carrying the kind of fear that doesn't come from disobedience, but from survival. Moments later, officers knocked on the Turpin door. Louise answered. She was calm, smiling. Her hair was dyed blonde, curled into tight ringlets, and she wore a long floral nightgown, the kind sold in discount catalogues. She spoke with an almost sugary voice. "Oh my," she said, "is something wrong?" David stood behind her. He looked more confused than surprised. His eyes kept darting behind the officers, as if checking whether neighbors were watching. "We received a call," the deputy said. "Concern about the welfare of children in the home." Louise laughed, then tried to mask it with a cough. "Oh, goodness, that's probably a mistake. Our kids are asleep. Big family, you know how it is. Sometimes people get the wrong impression." "We'd like to come inside," the deputy said, "to make sure everyone is okay." Louise hesitated. Then something flickered across her face, a sliver of recognition, of calculation. She moved aside. The officers stepped in. The smell hit them first, a thick, sour blend of sweat, feces, and decay. It wasn't just unclean. It was biological, rotting, oppressive. Flies buzzed near the entry. The air was stagnant. The living room was bare. No decorations, no family portraits, no toys, just old furniture, stained carpets, and broken blinds. A hallway led to the back of the house. That's where the cries came from. "Help!" a voice whispered, then louder. "Help us!" Deputy Cullis moved fast. He entered one of the bedrooms. The door was bolted, but David offered the key with a trembling hand. Inside were two girls, thin as reeds, chained by their ankles to the bedposts. Their eyes were swollen, their lips cracked. One was missing teeth. They flinched at the light. Another bedroom. A boy, around 12, lay curled on the floor in a corner, his knees against his chest. He looked 6. He stared blankly at the wall, unmoving. A chain clattered near him, previously fastened to his wrist, now left dangling from a metal hook drilled into the baseboard. Room by room they found more. All 13 children were there, ranging in age from 2 to 29. None of them looked their age. They were malnourished, underdeveloped, filthy. Some could barely walk. Most couldn't answer basic questions. They didn't know what a police officer was. They didn't know what medication meant. They didn't know what year it was. In one closet, the officers found piles of soiled diapers. In another, a journal, handwritten pages filled with schedules, prayer punishments and begging entries. "Please let me eat. Please let me sleep. I won't sin again." Deputy Cullis turned to David. "What is this?" he asked. David mumbled something about religious discipline, about God's chosen family, about obedience. Louise kept smiling, a cracked, glazed-over expression, like someone performing for a mirror. The paramedics were called. One by one, the children were removed from the home. They squinted in the daylight. Some covered their faces. Some smiled. One girl sobbed the moment her foot touched the pavement. When Jennifer, the eldest, was asked if she could walk to the ambulance, she nodded, then collapsed. Her legs couldn't support her. She had been shackled for weeks. In the emergency room, doctors gasped. The children were dangerously underweight, suffering from muscle atrophy, vitamin deficiencies, and heart irregularities. Many had cognitive delays. Some had nerve damage from the chains. They were decades behind in education. A few didn't know what a toothbrush was, but they were alive, barely. But alive, the youngest, the toddler, was the healthiest. He'd been spared the worst, likely because he was still young enough to appear cute in public. The others had been disposable. As news broke, the world recoiled. The headlines screamed, "House of Horrors. 13 siblings found shackled in California home. Children held captive by their parents for years." David and Louise Turpin were arrested that same day. Their charges would include torture, child endangerment, abuse of dependent adults, and false imprisonment. When their mugshots were released, people were shocked. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like someone's accountant, someone's aunt, plain, unassuming, but behind those eyes lived decades of calculated, religiously justified horror. And now the world had to decide what to do with the survivors. The courtroom in Riverside County was overflowing the day David and Louise Turpin were arraigned. Journalists packed the benches, advocates and social workers leaned against walls. Reporters whispered into microphones as the couple entered. chained now themselves, clad in orange and grey prison scrubs. Louise's dyed blonde hair had dulled to a straw-like mess. David's once pristine shirt collars were replaced by a sagging neckline and hollowed eyes. They avoided looking at each other. Neither looked at the cameras, neither looked at the prosecutors or the crowd. Only once did Louise glance upward, not at the judge, but at the ceiling, as if looking for something divine. The charges were read aloud, one by one: 12 counts of torture, 12 counts of false imprisonment, 7 counts of abuse of a dependent adult, 6 counts of child abuse, 1 count of a lewd act on a child under 14. Their bail was set at $9 million each. David's attorney claimed that while the household may have been unconventional, there had been no intent to harm. He referenced their religious beliefs, saying the Turpins believed in rigorous child discipline in accordance with their faith. The courtroom gasped. The prosecution responded with photographs. Dozens of them. Bruised wrists, chains embedded into ankles, hollow eyes, a crib with scratch marks on the inside, mattresses soaked in urine, and the journal, the one where a child had scrawled the same phrase over and over again: "I want to wake up and not be afraid." The world watched in horror. For the first few weeks, the Turpin children remained anonymous in media reports. Their names were shielded, their hospital locations guarded. Public donations flooded in, nearly $500,000 raised by non-profits and private individuals who wanted to help give these children a new life. Inside the hospital, recovery began. For the first time in years, the children were allowed to eat freely. Jennifer, the eldest, asked for music. She was given headphones and cried the first time she heard a song that wasn't a church hymn. Jordan, the one who escaped, was asked if she wanted to go outside. She said yes. When the nurses wheeled her to the garden courtyard, she broke down sobbing. She had never felt grass under her feet. A psychiatrist who evaluated them said they were the most polite, grateful, soft-spoken children I've ever met. And yet, they were deeply afraid of freedom. They were institutionalized without walls. Their bodies healed faster than expected. Their minds did not. Still, the public wanted a story of hope. The children were placed with foster families. Some of them reunited. Others went into adult care facilities. They were told they'd be given money for housing, for therapy, for education, from the very fund set up in their names. The world exhaled, thinking the nightmare was over, but it wasn't. In 2021, 3 years after their rescue, an ABC News investigative report shattered the illusion of salvation. The 2020 special, Escape from a House of Horror, aired interviews with Jordan and Jennifer, now legally able to speak. Their voices shook, but their message was clear. We were failed again. The so-called new lives they were promised? A lie. Several of the Turpin children were placed in abusive foster homes where some were sexually molested, beaten, or starved all over again. One child was told she would be sent back to her parents if she didn't obey. Another was locked in a room for hours at a time by her new caregivers. Jennifer, now in her 30s, had been forced to live in a dangerous neighborhood, assaulted once in public, and struggled to find work because of her past. Jordan had been homeless for weeks. All this while the $500,000 donated by the public for their recovery sat locked in a government trust. The county officials claimed they were protecting the funds until proper channels could be established. In reality, there was no plan, no therapy, no consistent education, no trauma-informed guidance. The same system that had failed to save them in childhood was now failing them in freedom. It sparked outrage. Reporters pressed Riverside County for answers. The Public Guardian's office dodged responsibility. Social services blamed staffing shortages. Local leaders promised investigations, but accountability remained elusive. Even the state's attorney general admitted it was unacceptable. Meanwhile, David and Louise Turpin stood trial. They pled guilty in 2019 to 14 felony counts each. In exchange, the children, those who wished to, wouldn't have to testify in court. On the day of sentencing, several of the siblings chose to speak. Jennifer stepped up first, her voice clear but trembling. "My parents took my whole life. From me, but now I'm taking it back," she said. "I am stronger than what they made me." Jordan spoke next, now 19, no longer the girl behind the stop sign. "Life may have been bad," she said, "but it made me strong. I fought to become the person I am. I saw my siblings chained up. I saw them crying. I had to do something." The courtroom was silent. David Turpin wept. He said he was sorry. Louise said she never intended harm and that she hoped her children could forgive her someday. The judge handed down their sentence, life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Not long after, the courtroom emptied. The headlines faded. The cameras stopped rolling, but the children were still there, not children anymore, piecing together broken identities in a world that didn't know what to do with them. Jordan, in her ABC interview, put it best: "People want a happy ending, but we're still trying to figure out what that means." Time passed, not in the clean, cinematic way where pain fades with a montage and violins swell, but in uneven pulses. A stumble, a step forward, two back. The world, eager for a redemption arc, moved on. But healing, for the Turpin children, was not a single journey. It was 13 separate ones, each carved out of different scars, different memories, and different levels of belief that life could be something more than what they had endured. Jennifer found strength in her music. She moved into her own apartment, small, quiet, and empty at first, but hers. She began teaching herself to play piano on a donated keyboard, finding the notes that had lived in her mind since childhood. When asked what freedom meant, she said, "It's being able to close your eyes and not be afraid when you open them." Jordan, the girl who'd once called 911 with a stolen phone and trembling voice, became a symbol of bravery. She completed her high school equivalency diploma, enrolled in college, and started studying criminal justice. She wanted to become a lawyer, not to put people in prison, but to make sure no child ever had to escape the way she did. She gave speeches now, timid at first, then stronger. Her story didn't end on Muir Woods Road. It started there. One of the middle boys, who had gone years without speaking above a whisper, discovered he had a talent for drawing. He sketched obsessively, pages and pages of wolves, forests, and, strangely enough, open windows. His therapist believed the art was his way of reprocessing fear. He didn't speak much, but when someone asked him what he wanted to be, he wrote one word: free. The youngest of the siblings, the toddler spared from the worst of the abuse, grew up with no memory of chains. But he inherited the aftermath. He asked often why his last name made people flinch, why his parents were in jail, why he didn't have baby pictures. His foster parents, some of the few who offered genuine care, answered as best they could, gently, with honesty. But not all of the children thrived. Some disappeared into the system, shuffled between homes, group facilities, halfway programs that offered roofs but not healing. One sibling tried to end their life. Another was hospitalized for severe PTSD after being abused again in foster care. Several battled depression, anxiety, eating disorders, compulsions developed from years of neglect. Trust was not a seed that could grow easily in soil salted by cruelty. In 2022, Riverside County launched an internal review. It found gaps in oversight, communication breakdowns, and funding mismanagement. But no one was fired. No criminal charges were filed. The money raised for the children's care remained trapped in bureaucratic purgatory, guarded by trustees more concerned with protocols than people. Public outrage flared and faded like a seasonal fire. Still, the siblings moved forward, some quietly, some publicly. They began reconnecting with each other. Phone calls turned into group chats. A few started visiting each other, slowly rebuilding the idea of family on their own terms. They had never known birthdays before. Now they celebrated them, with cake, with friends, with candles that didn't smell of mold or punishment. Some wrote letters to their parents, not to forgive, not always, but to say what they had never been allowed to say. You broke me, but you didn't erase me. I survived you. I am not what you told me I was. In 2023, Jennifer stood on a stage at a trauma survivors conference and shared her story with a crowd of strangers. She began with a quote, "The chains are broken, but the bruises don't vanish overnight." Then she smiled, a real smile, the kind no one had to rehearse, and said, "But I'm still here. We're still here, and every breath we take is a rebellion." That night, 13 candles were lit on the edge of the stage, not for pity, not for sorrow, but for each life that refused to be swallowed by darkness. David and Louise Turpin will die in prison. But their children? Their children are writing their own endings now, and the world, if it's still listening, has a duty to make sure. Their stories don't become just another headline, but a warning, a call to vigilance, a reminder that horror can wear a human face, a parent's name, a family's smile, and sometimes the most courageous thing a child can do is run.